The story of New York City's transit system is one of ambition, political conflict, financial crisis, and the perpetual gap between grand vision and practical reality. Long before the subway existed, the city's streets were dominated by horse-drawn cars running along steel rails, a system that was slow, unreliable, and fundamentally ill-suited to a rapidly expanding metropolis. Animals tired easily, required constant feeding and care, and could not keep pace with the demands of a city whose population was growing at a staggering rate. Engineers and inventors recognized the problem clearly, and between 1825 and 1899, the United States Patent Office received no fewer than 125 separate proposals for elevated transit systems, intended to replace the horse cars and bring order to the chaos of urban movement. These proposals ranged from the practical to the fantastical. One early concept, known as the arcade railway, suggested keeping horses entirely but elevating them to a platform above the street while trains operated below. John Randall Jr. proposed a 3-mile elevated track along Broadway. James Sweat envisioned a steam-powered locomotive with passenger cars suspended beneath it. Rufus Gilbert proposed an elevated train powered by steam pneumatics that would launch cars from station to station. Nearly all of these proposals focused on Broadway, the city's most congested and commercially vital artery, but that concentration was also their downfall. Property owners and shopkeepers along Broadway fiercely opposed any construction that might affect their land values. And without a resolution to that political obstacle, proposal after proposal stalled before it could move forward. The man who finally found a way around this impasse was Charles Harvey, a civil engineer whose earlier success in connecting Lake Superior and Lake Huron had earned him powerful political connections. Harvey shared the conviction that elevated transit was the answer to New York's congestion, but he was shrewd enough to avoid the Broadway battleground entirely. Instead, he proposed building his elevated line along Greenwich Street and 9th Avenue, far enough from the commercial heart of the city to sidestep opposition, but close enough to make a meaningful difference. He financed a test track with his own money, promising to demolish it if the experiment failed. In 1867, he successfully piloted a single car along a half-mile stretch of track at a top speed of 10 miles per hour. The system was cable-driven, which proved to be a vulnerability, but Harvey had time to address the technical problems before competitors closed in. While Harvey was working above ground, a very different vision was taking shape beneath it. Alfred Ely Beach, an engineer who had been inspired by the opening of London's Underground Railway in 1863, believed that the solution to urban congestion lay not in the air but underground. His concept relied on compressed air generated by a massive steam-powered fan to propel cars through a cylindrical tunnel. The problem was political. New York City at the time was effectively controlled by William Marcy Tweed, the notoriously corrupt political boss whose ties to the horse car companies gave him every reason to block any competing transit proposal. Beach applied for official permission to build a subway and was refused repeatedly. His solution was a masterstroke of deception. He requested permission instead to build a pneumatic mail tube beneath Broadway, leased a building above the proposed route, and began digging at night using hand tools and an innovative tunneling shield designed to avoid disturbing the street surface. Materials were smuggled in through side streets. The work was kept entirely secret until 1870, when Beach revealed his completed pneumatic transit project to an astonished public. It was a fully functional subway, and it was an immediate sensation. Beach proposed extending the line 5 miles to Central Park, but Tweed blocked the permit once again. Having recently secured a charter for his own elevated railway company and seeing in Beach's subway a direct threat to his monopoly, the contest between underground and elevated transit was now fully joined, and it played out against the backdrop of Tweed's eventual downfall. A series of political cartoons by illustrator Thomas Nast prompted investigations that exposed years of embezzlement, bribery, nepotism, and electoral fraud. Tweed was convicted of 102 separate crimes and sentenced to 12 years in prison. With his grip on the city broken, Harvey's elevated line was reorganized under the New York Elevated Railway Company, and the cable system was replaced with steam-powered locomotives. The technology worked, and the elevated trains began to expand. But the financial crisis of the era made investors skittish, and Beach's pneumatic subway, still considered somewhat experimental, lost its financial backing. By the late 19th century, the elevated trains had won the first round of competition, and private rail companies built a network of lines across Manhattan that transformed previously rural areas into dense urban neighborhoods. Harlem, once a landscape of farms and country estates, filled rapidly with row houses. The Bronx saw similar growth along its elevated corridors. The transformation was remarkable in its speed, with hundreds of blocks of track constructed in just a few years. Yet the elevated lines were far from ideal. They were enormous, smoke-belching machines that blocked sunlight, generated tremendous noise, and created shadowy corridors beneath their tracks that became associated with crime and social disorder. They were an improvement over nothing, but they were already being overtaken by new thinking. The critical technological shift came with electrification. Thomas Edison's Pearl Street Power Station opened in Lower Manhattan in 1882, establishing one of the world's first centralized electrical grids. Brooklyn received its first electric streetcar in 1890, and the success of that system prompted a rapid conversion of the horsecar network to electric trolleys across the city. The trolleys were twice as fast as their predecessors and far more reliable. When the elevated lines were converted to electricity as well, the absence of steam and smoke suddenly made it far more reasonable to consider placing railway tracks underground. The political landscape had also shifted. In 1898, New York's 5 boroughs consolidated into a single city government, dramatically expanding the administrative area and creating the institutional foundation for a genuinely integrated regional transit network. London already had an electric underground system, and Paris had unveiled its metro at the 1900 World's Fair. New York, now positioning itself as one of the world's great cities, could no longer afford to lag behind. Construction on the subway began in 1900, and within 4 years, 9 miles of track and 28 stations were completed. The line was publicly funded but privately operated by the Interborough Rapid Transit Company, running from City Hall to Harlem for a flat fare of 5 cents. Before the first line was even finished, the public was demanding more. Planning for expansion fell to the Board of Rapid Transit Railroad Commissioners, which in 1902 tasked Chief Engineer William Barclay Parsons with developing a comprehensive transit plan covering all 5 boroughs. His vision extended into Brooklyn, the Bronx, and Queens, with multiple lines planned for the east side of Manhattan. By the time Parsons published his plan in 1906, the original subway line was already operating at capacity. Daily ridership reached 800,000 passengers by 1908. Oversight passed to the State Public Service Commission, which produced what became known as the Triborough Plan, featuring 3 main routes: a line stretching from the tip of Manhattan through the Bronx, a subway beneath 4th Avenue in Brooklyn branching out to Bay Ridge, Coney Island, and other neighborhoods, and several additional connections across the city. Much of this plan was ultimately constructed, but progress then stalled amid disagreements between the mayor and the commission over whether to extend existing lines or build an entirely new independent system. The private railroad companies, facing no real competition and receiving no clear political direction, had little incentive to expand on their own. That changed when an outside investor named William Gibbs expressed interest in connecting existing routes with his own railroad network. The prospect of genuine competition prompted the IRT and the Brooklyn Manhattan Transit Corporation, known as the BRT, to negotiate what became the dual contracts, separate agreements with each company under which the city built new subways and rehabilitated existing elevated lines and then leased them to the private operators. Costs were shared between the city and the companies. The expansion that followed under the dual contracts built the majority of the subway infrastructure that New Yorkers use today, and it stands as the most significant single period of transit construction in the city's history. Despite this success, the Public Service Commission continued to be seen as unwieldy and overextended, responsible simultaneously for transit construction and the regulation of all other public utilities. In 1919, Governor Alfred E. Smith signed legislation separating these functions, and the new Transit Construction Commissioner appointed Daniel L. Turner as chief engineer. Turner's vision was sweeping. He believed that the subway could and should be used as a tool to distribute the city's population more evenly across all 5 boroughs, reducing the crushing density of Manhattan and opening underdeveloped areas to growth. In 1920, he released a comprehensive plan calling for more than 830 miles of new routes, more than double the system's existing mileage and significantly more than what exists today. He proposed completing this expansion within 25 years. Politics intervened almost immediately. Mayor John F. Hylan, who harbored a deep personal animosity toward the privately operated transit companies dating back to his dismissal from the BRT for reckless driving, was determined to push the IRT and BRT out of business entirely. He withheld funds for new lines, denied building permits, and refused to permit any increase in the 5-cent fare, hoping to starve the private operators of revenue. His counter-proposal involved building more than 100 miles of new city-owned lines and taking over another 100 miles from the private companies, all within 3 years. The State Transit Commission dismissed this plan as unrealistic, and Turner was asked instead to draft a more measured proposal focused on suburban rapid transit and the relief of subway overcrowding. Turner's revised plan centered on 2 loop lines in Lower and Midtown Manhattan, designed to connect the Long Island Railroad and New Jersey commuter lines with the city's internal subway network, providing additional rapid transit capacity to local riders at the same time. Hylan, unbowed, pushed the city to take back direct control of transit oversight and appointed John Delaney as chairman of a new municipal board of transportation. By the end of the same year, Delaney put forward an independent city-owned expansion plan calling for roughly 100 miles of new routes, 12 in Manhattan, 19 in the Bronx, 17 in Brooklyn, and 52 in Queens, with the stated goal of placing subway service within half a mile of every resident's home. The plan was formally proposed in 1929, just months before the stock market crash that inaugurated the Great Depression. With the city's finances in collapse, the full plan was never built. The Depression years forced a retreat from ambition to survival. Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia merged the IRT and BRT into a unified city-run system primarily to reduce operating costs. Planning continued even when construction did not, and in 1939 Delaney unveiled a new proposal that included a Second Avenue subway running from Lower Manhattan into the Bronx, 3 major expansions in the Bronx, extensions of the Queens Boulevard and Van Wyck Boulevard lines in Queens, and multiple new connections in Brooklyn. World War II redirected the city's resources before any of it could be built. By the time the war ended, a new force had reshaped the city's priorities entirely. Robert Moses, who rose to power in the 1930s and would dominate New York's physical development for the next 5 decades, saw highways as the future and transit as the past. He championed the demolition of the remaining elevated lines in Manhattan, which were eventually torn down, and advocated for the removal of streetcar tracks to make room for automobiles. Moses was extraordinarily effective at realizing his own vision, and transit leadership was correspondingly weak. The subway fare remained frozen at 5 cents until 1948, leaving the system chronically underfunded. When the city issued bonds in 1951, the proceeds went to maintenance and modernization of existing infrastructure rather than new construction. Moses diverted funds that had been earmarked for a subway extension in the Bronx to finance his own highway projects and claimed rights of way that had been reserved for rapid transit to build additional road infrastructure. By the end of his influence, the city-operated subway was burdened with deferred maintenance and incapable of pursuing the expansions that earlier planners had envisioned. Control of the subway passed from the city to the state, and the new Metropolitan Transportation Authority launched an ambitious proposal called the Program for Action, which outlined a new wave of expansion. But just as the Depression and the war had halted previous plans, the fiscal crisis of the 1970s brought this one to an end as well. The city teetered on the edge of bankruptcy, the subway descended into a period of severe deterioration, and the physical system became a symbol of urban decline more broadly. Recovery came gradually through the 1980s and accelerated in the 1990s as both the economy and the transit system stabilized. Yet the decades of underinvestment had left their mark in ways that could not be quickly undone. More than a century after the original subway opened, and despite the eventual construction of a truncated version of the long-planned Second Avenue line, the New York City subway remains far short of what Turner, Delaney, and their predecessors imagined. The gap between vision and reality is not primarily a failure of imagination. The city and its engineers have never lacked for ambitious ideas. It is rather a story of how political conflict, economic crisis, institutional fragmentation, and competing private and public interests have repeatedly interrupted the kind of sustained, long-term commitment that building a world-class transit network requires. The history of what was planned and never built is, in many ways, as consequential as the history of what was actually constructed, because the missing lines shaped the city's development just as surely as the ones that were completed, by limiting where people could live, how quickly neighborhoods could grow, and how fully the 5 boroughs could function as a unified and connected whole.